You're listening to the Rundown Live. Your protection from deception. And your forecast into the future.
Do you know that the average person does not think? Do you know that thinking is a subject that's not taught in school? You'll say everybody thinks. Hardly anyone thinks. I remember old Nightingale used to say, if the average person said what they were thinking, they would be speechless. Do you know what we do? We confuse mental activity with thinking. That's not thinking. Listen to what most people are saying. They'd never say what they're saying if they were thinking. Watch their behavior. They'd never do what they're doing if they were thinking. In absence of clearly defined goals, we become strangely loyal to performing daily trivia until ultimately we become enslaved by it. That's probably what the people were doing that we surrounded by as we were little kids. The ideas that just keep going in over and over and over again form the paradigm. A paradigm is nothing but a multitude of ideas that are fixed in the subconscious mind. Here we are, as hard as it is to believe, 20, 30, 50, 60 years later, living exactly the same as we were programmed when we were little kids.
Number one role in mind control is if you can distract the subconscious, if you can distract the conscious mind, it leaves the subconscious mind wide open for you to pimp them like hoes. See what I'm saying?
The things that we found in other Air Force documents, one in particular was a document put together in '82. The document was called Low Intensity Conflict in Modern Technology, with a foreword by none other than Newt Gingrich. One section spoke about using radio frequency radiation transmitters for disrupting human thinking, for basically debilitating troops invisibly by being able to bombard them with radio frequency that was tuned to just the right frequency, in just the right waveform, so as to totally disrupt their mental process.
The CIA wanted to take control of people's minds, and they realized it was a two-part process. First, you need to blast away the existing mind, and second, you need to find a way to insert a new mind into the resulting void. This is what's known as Project MKUltra, the most sustained search in history for techniques of mind control. After World War II, the tension between the two emerging superpowers, the US and the then Soviet Union, was at an all-time high. The threat of nuclear war was hanging over everyone's head, and ultimately the end of civilization. Technological progress didn't stop at the atom bomb, and both sides were continuing to invent bigger and badder weapons. But what both sides knew is that the most dangerous weapon was information, and the US became increasingly concerned that the Soviets had discovered a drug or technique that would allow them to control human minds. In response, the CIA began its own secret program to search for a mind control weapon they could use against their enemies. The experiments were covertly funded at universities and research centers, as well as American prisons and detention centers in Japan, Germany, and the Philippines, and the subjects endured procedures including electroshock and high doses of hallucinogens.
Also, but when I broke my programming, which means I started to remember that I had been programmed, that I was leading a double life, in essence, for a number of years, many years. It's when you break your programming, it's very difficult. But when you break your programming, they'll do whatever they have to do in order to make sure that they re-recruit you, or they can stop that from happening. So if they can't stop you from remembering, they hope that they can stop you from speaking.
Remember this guy, Charlie Manson? He started a cult in the 60s called The Family and manipulated his followers to commit mass unaliving of a group of Hollywood elites in their mansion. Well, the case is even more disturbing than it appears, and yes, the CIA was involved. During that time, the CIA was obsessed with mind control experiments, and they were basically looking for a way to develop what they referred to as a Manchurian candidate, or someone that could be manipulated into unaliving American government enemies. The CIA also thought a little compound called LSD showed great potential in its ability to facilitate mind control. And guess who's confirmed to have been a part of at least 2 LSD mind control experiments during this time? None other than Charlie Manson. In fact, Manson's parole officer, Roger Smith, was a PhD student at Berkeley that had been granted money by the CIA to research LSD use. What a coincidence. Roger Smith set up a free clinic in San Francisco where he administered LSD to Manson and many of Manson's followers. Those experiments later came to be known as a part of MKUltra, and Manson later came to be known as one of the most dangerous and prolific cult leaders of all time. Manson completely brainwashed his victims to do his violent bidding and commit unspeakable acts that they wouldn't have even considered before they met him. This was an ability that the CIA was actively researching and trying to replicate for use by the American government. So do you think Manson's involvement with the CIA was a coincidence? Or do you think it was an intentional experiment to see how far cult followers could be pushed when under the influence of a charismatic leader like Manson?
It was so hard to come running out of a hell that nobody believed existed. My name is Kathy O'Brien, and I'm a survivor of MKUltra mind control. The MKUltra program was to ultimately control the minds of the population for implementing what Adolf Hitler first termed the New World Order. When girls reached age 30, they were murdered or they were sacrificed. I was going to be killed as well. I was to go out in a blaze of glory and be burned alive. I'm so fortunate that an intelligence insider who saw the kind of corruption that was going on in the highest levels of government decided to take action and rescued me and saved my life so that we could begin to expose what was being done.
I'm Chrissy Newton. I was the subject in radiation as well as mind control and drug experiments performed by a man I knew as Dr. Green. And Donald Richard Ebner, my natural father, was involved with Dr. Green in the experiments. Dr. Green performed radiation experiments on me in 1970. All these experiments were performed on me in conjunction with mind control techniques and drugs in Tucson, Arizona. Dr. Green was using me mostly as a mind control subject. His objective was to gain control of my mind and train me to be a spy assassin. The first significant memory took place at Kansas City University in 1966. I was in what looked like a laboratory and there seemed to be other children. I was strapped down, naked, spread eagle, on a table, on my back. Dr. Green had electrodes on my body, including my head. He used what looked like an overhead projector and repeatedly said he was burning different images into my brain while a red light flashed aimed at my forehead. In between each sequence, he used electric shock on my body and told me to go deeper and deeper, while repeating each image would go deeper into my brain, and I would do whatever he told me to do. I felt drugged because he had given me a shot before he started the procedure. When it was over, he gave me another shot. The next thing I remember, I was with my grandparents again in Tucson, Arizona. I was 4 years old.
Talk was most likely a test bed for some of the technology interchange between the aliens and the U.S. government. That they were trying out a lot of these great ideas they got. They're also trying to replicate systems and technologies they had on the captured, crashed UFOs. Also, I can remember I had an office in the radar tower. It was the first office on the second floor in the back. Next to my office was another office, and I remember, I'll swear on a stack of Bibles, I remember a lizard man in that office. It was His Highness Draco something, I can't remember the other name. And he was about 6 foot, 7 foot tall, had sort of like scaly skin, humanoid. He walked erect like we do, had 2 arms, 2 legs. He had a tail, but it really didn't show most of it.
Disturbing intelligence programs of the Cold War. MKUltra. For decades, the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, ran secret experiments attempting to understand and potentially control the human mind. These programs tested everything from psychological manipulations to drugs like LSD, often without consent of the people involved. While many people associate MKUltra with experiments in the United States, some of the most controversial cases actually happened in Canada, particularly at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, under Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron. His experiments included techniques known as depatterning and psychic driving. Today, we're going to unpack the Canadian connection to MKUltra, the real victims of these experiments, and how some of these techniques influence later psychological and military research.
You're listening to the Rundown Live. Your protection from deception. And your forecast into the future.
Because of this administration, we are tonight a world divided. We are a nation becalmed. We have lost the brisk pace of diversity and the genius of individual creativity. We are plodding along at a pace set by centralized planning, red tape, rules without responsibility, and regimentation without recourse.
Madam Speaker, I have a few questions for my colleagues. What if our foreign policy of the past century is deeply flawed and has not served our national security interests? What if we wake up one day and realize that the terrorist threat is a predictable consequence of our meddling in the affairs of others and has nothing to do with us being free and prosperous?
To be fair, we had helped to create the problem we're now fighting. How? Because when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, we had this brilliant idea that we were going to come to Pakistan and create a force of mujahideen, equip them with Stinger missiles and everything else to go after the Soviets inside Afghanistan.
Promised as being one of the most effective treatments for AIDS and cancer in history. Now it's gone, and one of the most respected research facilities in the country is being blamed.
Participation in a process that validates an establishment that never meaningfully changes. What if that establishment doesn't want and doesn't have the consent of the governed? What if the two-party system was actually a mechanism used to limit so-called public opinion? What if there were more than two sides to every issue, but the two parties wanted to box you into a corner, one of their corners?
Censored by the mainstream media, the destroyer of fake news, and your host of the Rundown Live, Chrissy T. Harris.
Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in this United States. You're listening to the Rundown Live, Milwaukee's independent news and talk radio. I'm your host, Chrissy T. Harris, and we have a great show lined up for you guys today. You will not want to go anywhere. Chrissy Newton will be joining us in a few minutes here in this broadcast. It'll be an interesting show. We're going to be talking missing scientists, MKUltra, futurism. She's kind of like the female version of me. I've been watching some of her stuff. She's got a great show. We'll dive into that as well and a whole bunch of other things. But before we do, let's talk a little bit about where you can find this broadcast and support us. You can support us by smashing that like button, dropping some comments in the chat, sharing the live stream. And if you want to, there's little barcodes and QR codes in the beginning of the show if you want to donate and support us that way. But you can find us on Ground Zero Plus, Rumble, as well as Facebook, Twitter, and anywhere else where social media and podcasts are being broadcasted live. Also Spotify, of course, and iHeartRadio. So make sure you find us on those platforms. If you are listening today and you have questions for our guests, feel free to be engageful because I do check the comments. I do bring them up on the screen from time to time. So drop some comments in the chat if you do have questions for our guest today. And I guess we should probably start out by what the big news is all over the internet right now. And I can't say that I ever met, I've met a lot of people in my life, especially in futurism, UFO, ancient history, kind of what we would call, or my friend would call, the woo-woo crowd. And the woo-woo crowd are people that are kind of pioneers in some shapes and forms, and sometimes they're just a little bit out there, and you got to wonder, why is it that they believe what they believe? Are you missing something, or is there more to it? And the person is David Wilcock. Everyone knows, I think by now, that David Wilcock has passed. It's actually in the news, and I was one of the first people to actually publish the actual article, because everyone was saying, no, he's not dead, he's alive. He said if he ever killed himself, it would be, he would never do such a thing, investigate it. But doesn't mean that you shouldn't investigate that David Wilcock did something, as I just mentioned, because that is what law enforcement is now reporting. A death investigation near Ridge Road. I published this last night on my Facebook. If you're not following me on Facebook, Chrissy Harris is where you can find me there. And feel free to follow. My mom's on there too, but you know how it is, social media. Some people have separate social medias. I'm like, this is who I am. You either love me or you hate me, and I know it's dangerous. But here, let's put it on the screen. But so late last night, yesterday afternoon, I get this message and somebody's like, David Wilcock died, and I'm looking, and I found this interesting article. And it turns out that it was accurate. Boulder County Sheriff Office responded to a man who had used a weapon on himself. Essentially, the law enforcement came, is the story, and then he was on the phone with them, and then he shot himself in the head. That is at least what we are seeing in the information. Now, is that what happened? I'm not sure. If you don't know who David Wilcock is, let's see if I have a picture of David here. Let's see. There we go. This is David Wilcock. You guys might recognize him from the grand show Ancient Aliens, right? Ancient Aliens. And it's always sad to see somebody pass, but there are some things I want to bring awareness to. David Wilcock was willing to interview anyone, which is great, but he was a prominent person that went down the QAnon, the QAnon rabbit hole, we'll call it, right? Essentially, what we're finding out with the QAnon stuff is that Jeffrey Epstein met with Boris Nikolai in the Epstein files, or he set him up with the guy who created the politically incorrect forum that housed the QAnon, where they just soft dripped and leaked information so people would become naive to it and never would report on it because no one would believe it's happening because you must be a crazy QAnon conspiracy theorist. That was the psychology behind it. Anyways, David Wilcock was a big proponent of that ideology, JFK Jr. being alive. Don't agree with any of that. Now, I'm sorry for his family, his friends, and anyone I know that works in the UFO community that knows him and loves David. I've never met him. I've heard from people he was a really nice guy, right? But at the same time, you kind of have to look at the seeds that he planted and the trees and fruit that has grown from his work. And I'm not one to make judges or be judgmental on anything, but that is what I remember David Wilcock for, not to mention the bizarre comments that he'd make sometimes during his presentations. But a lot of people have great experiences with David. I'm sorry for your guys' loss. Yes, he committed suicide. I doubt that it was foul play. It was pretty clear cut, according to the report, that he shot himself in front of law enforcement. And of course, anyone with mental health crises or have a mental health crisis in their life should seek help or reach out to your friends or anything, that you might need. It doesn't hurt. And I'm sure David was loved by many, and I'm sorry to hear about his loss because I believe in redemption. It doesn't matter if you're Joe Biden, doesn't matter if you're Donald Trump, doesn't matter if you're Bill Gates. I believe that you can be redeemed, you can change who you are, and you can become a better person, right? At the end of the day, there's so many viewpoints, so many beliefs, and there's this elite class. And if we can't believe that these people can change, how can we believe that we ourselves can change, right? That being said, in the news, it's viral right now that Congress wants to have hearings and wants to be informed on what's going on with all these missing scientists. And we've been talking about this. In fact, we might be the very first news outlet to really report on this. And I was on some bigger programs hosting, right, reaching millions of people. And this was the subject I wanted to talk about, in the end of February. I was like, hey, you get a chance to talk and be a guest host. What do you want to talk about? I'm like, McCaslin. This is interesting. People are disappearing. And it's not something new. We talked about that on yesterday's program. For the last 30 years, there's dozens, if not 100, over 100 plus scientists connected to interesting studies, whether it's curing autism or curing cancer or doing other things, have disappeared. And we listed a lot of those individuals yesterday. A lot of that work was done by another individual, and we went over his work, you know. So it was very interesting nonetheless. But this is what we have in the news today. We have the news discussing, you know, finally what we've been talking about all along, and that is all these missing scientists that are disappearing, and there are dead ones as well. And we have to start asking questions, because if we don't ask questions as media, we cannot hold the government accountable. Now, with the Epstein files, they just started a war with Iran. They're like UFO disclosure. Forget everything in the Epstein files, but we haven't forgotten on the Rundown Live. So let's check this out right here, right now. This is the National News Desk talking about recent progress and, you know, what Congress wants to hear dealing with these individuals.
We're very concerned about this. This is a national security concern. This would suggest that something sinister may be happening. So we want to see what we can do, and hopefully with our bully pulpit, we can maybe bring attention to this and have anyone that knows of any information out there, have them contact Congress so we can help determine what's going on here.
House Oversight Committee Chair James Comer helping to lead the congressional investigation of a group of American scientists who've either turned up dead or disappeared. At least 11 of these scientists who vanished or died under mysterious circumstances are tied to U.S. nuclear and space research. Joining us this morning to discuss is former FBI Special Agent in Charge, Jody Weiss. Good morning to you, sir. We have to say also they have not been linked together, but one thing we do know, they all had high-level security clearances. So in reviewing these cases, you said a few things did stick out to you. Which things stuck out to you? And do you agree with House Oversight Committee Chair James Comer that something sinister is happening here?
Yeah, Jan, good morning. Great to be with you again. I think it's a bit too premature to call this sinister. Yes, it could be the result of foreign intelligence service operations. That's been taken in the past. They'd love to steal our intelligence. But right now, we just have a very odd cluster of cases. What makes it unusual to me is the fields where it comes from: defense, aerospace, nuclear. Yeah. In a 4-year period, to have 11 people disappear or turn up dead is unusual. But let's talk a minute about the clearance. People are getting really spun up on the clearances. There are hundreds of thousands of clearances given to government employees. Every FBI employee, not agent, employee, has a top secret clearance. And some of these, as you mentioned, the deaths, they can be explained. You had a couple of homicides, you had a suicide, you had 2 individuals that were colleagues at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory who died close to each other, but the family didn't release autopsies. But what sticks out to me are the disappearances. Think about it. You have Bill McCaskon, experienced hiker, goes out without his glasses and without a phone. Who would do that? I hike all the time out here in Arizona. I would never go out there without the ability to see or communicate. But the most unusual one, Jan, Monica Reza. She's hiking in the Angeles forest. She's with 2 companions. At about 9 o'clock in the morning, while one hiker looks back, sees his partner, she waves at him, she smiles, and then she's gone. So you've got 3 people, one turns up missing. The Los Angeles Sheriff's Department dispatches helicopters, dogs, ground teams, and they can't find her. So that is really unusual to me. So I'm so happy that the United States government is investigating this. They've got to look for patterns. They've got to see if there's any commonalities between this: finances, health, threats, and hopefully we'll have an answer in the near time. But what an odd group of cases.
Yeah, especially the one with Monica, as you mentioned before, because he did see her and claims he saw her, and you would think there would be some type of a body that would have been found by now. Jody, I also want to ask you very quickly about some of the developments involving the Nancy Guthrie disappearance case. Investigators right now are looking at new evidence. From your experience, what does it mean when the FBI takes a fresh look like this? Could this be the turning point?
Well, I certainly hope so, Jan, for the family's sake. You know, the FBI received some DNA evidence from inside the house, which makes it really, really good evidence because it came from someone inside. And hopefully that can be identified through their state-of-the-art technology as belonging to someone, or at the very least, being able to track through to the family through that genetic genealogy. But Jan, what's sad in all of this is this sat in a private lab for 11 weeks. 11 weeks this piece of DNA sat there. Well, this family suffered on this. So fingers crossed, prayers said that hopefully we'll get an answer here that either Nancy's recovered or at the very least, the family will finally get closure. But optimistic always.
As you said, though.
And that's an update on the missing scientists and where Congress is and looking at what's going on. And you guys heard it here on the Rundown Live first. We're going to go ahead and bring our guest on. It's going to be a very interesting broadcast for those that are tuning in. Our guest today is Chrissy Newton. She is a Canadian writer, podcaster, publicist, producer, and on-screen personality known for her work in UFOs, UAP, science, technology, and culture, and the unexplained. And she's also got an interest in a lot of things that are important to me, like MKUltra. I've been interviewing survivors for the last couple months after really diving deep into the Epstein files, trying to find out more about the abuse. She has an interest in futurism and tech. She's like the female version of me, guys. I want to welcome her to the broadcast. Welcome, Chrissy Newton, to the Rundown Live. How are you doing today? And thank you for joining us on this broadcast. Oh, we got no sound from you there, Chrissy. I don't know if you're muted. Oh, nope, still no sound from you, Chrissy.
Sorry.
There we go. Now we got you.
There you go. Sorry, I had to change a setting. It was in Camlink for some reason.
Yeah, we want to live forever with transhumanism, but we can't get the frickin' webcam to work, right?
That's how it works.
The state of the world, yeah.
I love that you said I'm the female version of you. I think that's amazing. I'm like, I love all these topics, and I love that so many people love them as well. Because I shouldn't say love. I'm interested. I'm super curious. Some I do, and some are just, with MKUltra, are just heartbreaking. So just good to know that other people are looking into it as well.
Well, yeah. So I was a key reporter in the Ghislaine Maxwell Jeffrey Epstein trial. No one wanted to cover that trial. So I went out there and I got some correspondence work for some alternative outlets, including Glenn Beck, but also the BBC, just to give you an idea. I'm an independent. I'm not really trying to lean one side or another. I just want the truth. I'm a truth seeker, right? And at the end of the day, I released all the victims' testimonies of what happened to them because no one would from what was said in the courtrooms. And that's why majority of the media and public actually knows what happened in the court during the Ghislaine Maxwell trial. But to fast forward, I also started digging deep into these Epstein files. And I was talking to my producer, Ron Patton, who also works with Clyde Lewis and Ground Zero. And you know, we were talking a little bit, and he's like, well, you know, MKUltra is a very interesting thing. Have you looked into that? And I knew a lot about it because I've done 1,000 podcasts, and it's hard to not research everything without falling, you know, into the rabbit hole of government mind control and Manchurian candidates. But then I started learning, I wanted to learn more about the programming process. I started reading weird things in the Epstein files, which collaborated with ritual abuse that I saw in testimonies. So I started interviewing survivors, and I've been blessed to have 5 survivors, alleged survivors, we're going to call them, because, you know, how do you really prove it at the end of the day, other than their stories sometimes are very eerily similar, especially when it came to deprogramming, programming, the abuse. It's always a government facility, whether it's a school, a military base. Sometimes it involves esoteric societies like Freemasonry. It's all over the board. And when you talk to these individuals, you can kind of go, well, either they've all been programmed the same way and they all have the same memories, or they've had similar experiences in their life. And it's heartbreaking. Like, I went back to church. I was like, I don't know what to do after reading all this stuff. I felt, you know, just read them. It's like, I can't sleep at night if you have a soul anyways, you know?
Yeah, I agree. It's so... Even stuff that I've read recently attached to Guantanamo Bay, most people won't know that MKUltra tactics were used there on innocent victims. And I've been speaking about that in most recent weeks and on my own podcast, because there's a victim that's still in Guantanamo Bay. He's, I'm not going to say his last name correctly. It's a very hard Islamic name, but he has been in there for over 20 years now, 15 years now. And he was one of the first people to receive the torture tactics that were part of some MKUltra tactics that they were using. And he was an innocent victim. And what they ended up finding is that the American government and multiple governments around the world have been saying that he was a man that had split personality disorder. So they've been torturing a man in Guantanamo Bay that was connected to 9/11 that had nothing to do with it, and he's still there and they can't get him out. Human rights organizations all the way from all different types of lawyers have been trying to get him out, and he's been awarded some money right now within the British government, and people are still saying, hey, why is he there? This man has gone through so much torture. Now his mental health is even worse. He's having seizures consistently. So there's just some stuff I've been doing around advocating for him and others because, a lot of people I know 9/11 was a horrible time for Americans. I'm Canadian. I don't agree with any of it, but there were innocent victims that were attached, unfortunately, to those raid sweeps when they picked everybody up and they put them into Camp 7 in Guantanamo Bay. It's horrendous.
Yeah, it's crazy. And what's the first green flag I got there was the fact that he had split personalities, because that's what they look for. I know, and I'm friends with one of the top narcotics law enforcement officers in the United States. He's now retired, Barry Cooper. He's well known for many other things. But he used to tell me when they looked for dogs that were drug-sniffing dogs, they wanted the dog that couldn't resist the ball. It had to have the ball, and that's the dog they wanted to train. So when you look at people who have bipolar disorders or mental disorders that create split personalities, these are ideal candidates to enter in a MKUltra ritual abuse type program where they basically delete who you are, develop through trauma bonds and trauma. They kind of break down everything about you, and then they create a new person, and they separate that using codes a lot of times. And I learned that from the Franklin case, where the guy was like, yeah, Eagle J 5262, fine. Am I talking to John? He's like, yeah, I'm John. I'm just giving you an example. It was a very interesting video. And he talked about that the government was training him to infiltrate the government. It was like an MKUltra plan to infiltrate our government with monarchs, which was a very interesting thing. And if you've not seen the court case where they do these hypnosis and reverse hypnosis testimonies, it's fascinating.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I imagine. I haven't seen the court case, but I can imagine. It's fascinating, but it's also horrendous. I was reading all that stuff about Guantanamo Bay before I went to bed one night, and I was like, highly do not recommend that for people. I'm like, and I was up all night because you can't sleep when you hear about those atrocities. It's just, and I still think about it consistently. So it's something I appreciate you and other people that are speaking about it, because there's so many victims that have been targeted by governments and organizations around the world that are never spoken to. With that said, we also know that there is a group called targeted individuals, and it doesn't mean that mental health doesn't play on a spectrum here. There's some people that aren't targeted. There's some people that are. So mental health is a big aspect of it, but there are people that have been victims of government programs that we see in MKUltra. We're seeing court cases still happening right now in Canada. We're seeing them happen in Montreal, where we're seeing all these survivors were only paid. The first reparation they were ever paid by the Canadian government was $100,000 for the torture that they'd endured at the Allen Morrill Institute in Montreal, attached to McGill University. Like, give me a break. And now they're fighting for more, and the government, a judge has now deemed that they are able to move forward with a larger lawsuit. So we're going to see what happens in Canada, and hopefully these people are getting paid millions for what they endured along with their families. And we see this even attached to things in residential schools. It's the same concepts that keep going. We see targeted individuals, we see women and minorities and all these people. I know some people might hear this as a triggered, word for them, but it is the truth. We are seeing it, and we're watching this happen within Canada and around the world. And people deserve, doesn't matter their gender, race, or creed, they deserve to be able to tell their story, but they should also be allowed to there has to be some resolve that goes with it, and money should be a big aspect of that.
Have you ever spoke to Chris Latour? He's in Canada, and he was one of the Montauk boys, allegedly, and I had a chance to interview him, and his experience was much like you described. It started out with school, right? It always seems to they identify these children at a young age. They're interested in Star Wars or The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or something like that. And they're like, oh, okay. And then they discuss that's like they buy the children from the parents. And the parents are like, well, he's going to have 401k for his life. He's doing something for our government, help our nation. And, it's going to create a better world. And they're sold this malarkey, essentially. And then from what I'm hearing is if there were deaths or people were injured, there was payouts, and it was basically hush money. So let's talk a little bit about your research. So you've done some research into the Canadian MKUltra. What were some of the recruiting methods and the things that people experienced early on in their MKUltra programming and deprogramming?
Yeah, well, we looked at things. There was tons of different things, but specific people that were recruited is we saw younger, adults as well, teenagers. We saw older adults, but we did see women. Women we dropped off at the Allen Morrill Institute in Montreal because that they were not listening to their husbands, or they were maybe going through forms of depression. So they would end up going into these programs and getting things like depatterning done to them, and all these different techniques, and, end up pretty much coming out like a Stepford wife, at times, and even men where their minds were literally erased. And, to the surprise to most people, some of these people have been able to regain their life back, but that whole time is erased for them, or if anything, it's, there's horrible memories attached. But the mind is so powerful when you think about it, having that much different types of torture done to you, and then being able to regroup yourself mentally again. One of the techniques that was done, which I think is horrendous, is they would do electric shock, but they would do it over like 4 or 5 times or 6 times the rate than normally done. But then what they end up doing would be putting a cassette at that point in time, or a recording underneath the patient's pillow that said things like, your mother hates you. Not even nice things, just horrible, horrible things, outside of using LSD, different types of drugs. And I think people might think that MKUltra is one program, but there was multiple programs attached to MKUltra. There's, there wasn't just one. And so one of the most predominant ones is, I believe, Project Monarch, where men were taken and Johns were put into different brothels, and they were given LSD from different sex workers, and then they were watched from another side, from the CIA or whoever the alphabet agency was that was watching them and documenting this. And this was against their will. Like sex workers, these are things that, if they're obviously not legal in certain countries, but it doesn't mean that they should be drugged with LSD and watched against their will, right? If anything, they would be arrested rather than drugged and used as guinea pigs. So it's just, it's horrendous, and we see, and this was consistent. The question is, what is happening today? And what will we find out in the next 20 to 30 years? And that's what I'm worried about. And I think a lot of us are. And I think that's what we're all looking into right now. And I'm not the only one. There's a couple journalists as well looking into these topics.
Yeah, it's really interesting, a lot of the things that you mentioned, because it collaborates with what I've heard, like from at least 2 of the victims that I interviewed. One of them said that every morning his mom would put a drop of acid on his tongue before she'd take him into school. And then he looked into something that was like a, we call it like a VR headset. I joke and call it like a was it virtual Game Boy back in the day, where you look into it. And he said that all it was horrific, people being mutilated, death, perverse, lewd sexual acts. And they would kaleidoscope it with all these different colors. And that was his first day at 6 years old going into school. And they threatened him that they weren't allowed to talk to their parents about what was happening in the school. And the LSD was there because the government also had weird, bizarre interest in remote viewing and astral projection.
Yeah. The Stargate, there's been multiple programs around remote viewing, right? In most recent days, Lou Elizondo is a whistleblower that worked in counterintelligence. And if you want to believe a counterintelligence or not, but he was saying that he was using a remote viewing technique too, that technically would have came out of a Stargate type of program that he was doing in Guantanamo Bay and to other alleged terrorists, where he was remote viewing and apparently scaring terrorists with a group of people. But, the thing is with remote viewing is that your body doesn't show up as an apparition, right? It usually is, you're the one seeing it and you're collecting information and coming back. From what I know, right? People aren't seeing it on the other end, unless maybe they're seeing it within a conscious state. But there have been claims that, people are still using it, and that, and we look at Joe McMonagle. I was very fortunate to have met Joe, who is part of the Stargate program. I believe, almost a year and a half ago, I met him at the Monroe Institute. He runs a program that you can go do for remote viewing, which is, go now, Joe's getting old, that you'd be able to speak a little bit more and you get one-on-one time with him while he's teaching you remote viewing techniques. So, this is coming from a man that's one of the best remote viewers in the world. So I don't know. It's hard to say it doesn't work.
Well, I think it's something that science can't explain yet. And we
Exactly.
want to, we're kind of like at the age where we're starting to understand more about humanity, that there are special skills and that we have these skills that we might have called, maybe they called it witchcraft or satanic or prophecy in the church or whatever it might be. But people have these gifts, and harvesting how to use them and growing those gifts is something that the MKUltra program was really interested in doing. But the Monarch program, man, that's a rabbit hole. We're talking about alpha, beta, theta, and omega programming, and thetas were normally identified as the ones that would be the sex slaves. They'd be like adult film star professionals, and they'd get into relationships, and then they could run an alpha program, which is assassination, or if they needed to, or take over a business. Russia had the Red Sparrow program, very similar. But our government is the United States government is the only one that had interest in this. But they would use these individuals, and it's funny because when I look at the Epstein files and all the claims of ritualistic abuse that were submitted, but that were kind of pushed aside because they were so crazy and so wild, they match the scientific research of the ritual abuse in the MKUltra. One of the monarchs I had a chance to interview, and she refused to do it on video and audio, but she told me, personally, her story, because she felt like she would be attacked. She says there's other monarchs, there's other MKUltra people out there, and what they do is they make your life hell if you're a whistleblower. And you don't know who they are, you don't know who you can trust. I can't help that individual's feelings. I totally understand where she's coming from because of the fact that she's been through so much. I don't know if I would know what to believe if I came out of a torture society like that. But she said it was like she was brought to a military base. They would starve her to death, and then they would come in with a gift, which was a beautiful pendant with diamonds on it. And they would give it to her. And then later on, when they would want that personality to come out, they'd bring out the amulet and they would say something to her, and she'd flip into that adult film actress. And she said she's been pushed into pornography against her will because they would bring out this other personality. And it was a very interesting conversation I had with her. But that was exactly what the Monarch program was alleged to be. And how is it that somebody that went through that knew exactly the step-by-step process without reading it? It's very interesting.
Yeah, and they're innocent people that are targeted. It's horrendous. It's so sad. And every day when I do think about this and I'm looking into stuff or I'm talking to victims myself, I'm just, I'm like, I'm so sorry. It's just, I know that coming from me or anybody else is not always going to help, but it is. It's just knowing that I think people do care and that we want to know.
So there's this very interesting link between Los Alamos and Jeffrey Epstein, which I'm trying, and since you're interested in UFO folklore and stuff like that, but there was claims that, the base that Phil Schneider was working on or interested in working on underneath Los Alamos Air Force Base, because it was this is a deep conspiracy. He was a contractor, built deep underground military bases, but it was linked to Jeffrey Epstein, and Epstein had his Zorro Ranch because it was close to Los Alamos. And so I've been kind of researching that, but, it's interesting to see the correlation of our government. And so a lot of times when I see these abductees or people who claim to be abductees, sometimes I wonder if they're MKUltra programs.
Oh, that's an interesting perspective. I've never thought of that. There could be crossover, right? We look at Paul Benowitz, and I'm not sure if you know the Paul Benowitz case and Richard Doty. So this would be crossover of UAP and UAP community and government and potentially MKUltra. But we're not 100% sure if MKUltra was done on Paul Benowitz. So Paul Benowitz was a man in the 80s who had government contracts, and was working in New Mexico. I'm losing the base right now in my mind. And lived right beside a base, Kirkland Air Force Base. There we go. And he was seeing what he thought was UFO-related extraterrestrial activity. So he would report it and document it. And what we ended up finding out is that Richard Doty was a CIA agent that went forward when he was 25 years old on his first actual gig that he got being in counterintelligence. And he went in and did a disinformation campaign on Paul Benowitz. And what Paul Benowitz was seeing was a national security issue. It wasn't anything to do with UFOs from what we know and what we've been told. But what Paul Benowitz did was went in and, Richard Doty went in and was teasing and messing with Paul Benewitz's mental health. We already know that potentially Paul Benowitz was having mental health issues already connected potentially with UAP and in general, but he was really interested in it. So what Richard Doty did was take that and then would show documents and tell stories and say that, Paul Benowitz was right and lead him down this wrong rabbit hole while messing with his mental health. And what we saw later on is that there were claims potentially that from which Richard Doty has said, and I've talked to him on my podcast about this, is that he was giving this information, but he had no idea if there was other agencies, potentially more agencies, doing disinformation on Paul Benowitz. And this is around the same time as MKUltra. So it doesn't mean that Paul Benowitz was not targeted with MKUltra. There was said that when Paul would wake up sometimes, and they don't know if he was doing it himself or somebody else was, that they were coming into the window and they were ejecting him with drugs. Yeah, or things to that degree. And so Paul would take off in the middle of the night, do really erratic things. But again, we have no idea if that was related to maybe MKUltra, another agency. Allegedly, Richard Doty tells me is that the American government was notified that this was happening to Paul Benowitz. So the whole thing here is that you have an innocent man that is getting close to national security secrets and the government is targeting him, knowing that his mental health is bad, taking care of his physical health, that Richard Doty would tell me, but they would care nothing about his mental health and pushed him over the edge. And then later on, people find Paul Benowitz in a mental health institution for a couple months, dealing with his mental health. And at that point, Richard Doty said at one point before Paul died, he went in, and said to him and apologized and said none of this was real. And Paul didn't want to believe him. It's horrendous. So this is a prime example of connected to the UAP community that we saw, and MKUltra he could have been an MKUltra victim too. We don't know because they were already doing enough mental health problems and issues with him and techniques. Why wouldn't they do that?
Well, yeah. So I've had a lot of questions when it came to the UAP phenomenon, and I've happened to make a lot of friends. One of them you might know is Richard Dolan, Mark D'Antonio, who is a top astronomer. Mark is a real close friend of mine.
He's a good guy. I love Mark. He's such a sweetheart. He actually quotes on my articles a lot about astronomy. So
yeah, me and him, we fight sometimes. We talk, especially when it comes to geoengineering and things that he isn't really sold on. But, one of the questions I asked Mark very hard because he's like the geoforensic analysis guy for video. He's like he's like the gatekeeper of what is real and what is not. Yeah. And so I asked him a very difficult question at a conference because I wanted to see if I could, as a friend, he'll kind of be like, So I asked him at the conference and I said, Mark, how many real UFO videos, how many videos have you seen that are genuinely real? And he's like, well, there's some government ones that are legitimate. And I said, well, okay, so if the only legitimate UFO videos we can say that we know are real and that we can't really say are something else, are filmed by our military, how do we know that it's not our military testing advanced aircraft on our own army to see if it works? Because if we were going to use it in war, we'd want to test it out on our own people first. And he's like, well, that's a really good question. I don't know if I have an answer to that. And that's kind of where I'm at with it, is like, how much of this could be our own government versus extraterrestrial?
I agree with you. I actually just said this in my podcast last week. So similar to that. I told you. We're on the same wavelength. Yep. And I said the same thing. I go, I was talking to Mark Pickleton, who did Mirage Men, which is an amazing movie and an unbelievable book. He's the author. And he talks a lot about misinformation and disinformation. And I'm very interested in that and talk about it myself and write about it. And I said to him, how is government documents, the smoking gun? I said, when we've had so many fake ones, how are we supposed to believe what is real and not? And how is that the smoking gun when there's so many are fake? And that's the challenge with disclosure, right? A lot of people will use government documents or government images and say, well, this has to be right, when it's not true, because we've seen the government lie to us in multiple different ways. So I agree with you. How do we not know that this is not our own, and using it as propaganda, against other countries to be like, oh, we don't want them to know that we do have this type of technology, so we're going to call it a UFO. And very similar to things like in the Cold War, we're seeing that Cold War essence of UAP kind of come back now in its own modern context. So I talk about that a lot because I see the parallels, and it's interesting that you bring that up too, because a lot of people listening to this that love UAP and love disclosure would not agree with that.
Well, the thing is that we're programmed, right? This comes back to MKUltra again. I believe the average citizen and the average American probably doesn't have an original thought in their mind. And I don't mean that in a mean way. I mean that we've been programmed from the minute we've been born. We learn to love red and yellow. We see McDonald's. We go get some McNuggets. We have the dopamine from the Happy Meal. And whenever we're adult now, we see the Golden Arches and we go get some slop to put in our stomach because that's what we see. We don't have an original thought. And I think that a lot of humanity, it's really hard to deprogram them because they've been programmed by television culture, by movies, by Hollywood. I love X-Files. I'm not going to lie. I think X-Files is a great program. It really helped my interest in this subject as well. But at the same time, we have to question everything and listen to everyone. And one of the most common things I could think of is, why wouldn't it just be our own government doing these things? Cattle mutilation, all these bizarre things could be more rationally explained as in, this is a government top secret program. They don't want people to know. And, are there UFOs? Well, I guess we got the Tom DeLonge email to John Podesta where he's like, McCaslin, I was talking to him, and that's where we took the Roswell crash, was right at Patterson Air Force Base, which is linked to a lot of other weird, bizarre, experimental situations. One of them was, I was talking to Brad Olson, who's another interesting individual I've gotten to meet over the years, and he's kind of an expert on Antarctica, and he was telling me a story about some researchers that disappeared and then they reappeared, but they shipped all their scientific equipment back to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Nobody knew what happened to them, and then they just wanted to leave. They appeared out of nowhere after they thought they lost this expedition for a couple weeks, and they showed back up at the base, and they just wanted out of there. No one said a thing, and they shipped everything to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And I'm like, that's another link. Your brain's always thinking, how do the patterns work? Where does it go? What does that all link to the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base? Well, it's more than just aircraft, and either they wanted Tom DeLonge to believe that's where they took the Roswell crash, and there is no Roswell crash, or that's where they took it, and McCaslin was letting them know. Those are what I've limited it down to,
Oh, for sure. We see that even in Life magazine. There was the Pentagon strategy board that was happening in the 50s and 60s. Could have been 40s as well, but I believe 50s and 60s. That Life magazine, which most people won't believe, which I know, and it's wild to believe this, but Life magazine was very much influenced by that propaganda strategy board that was working within the CIA and the Pentagon. So right there, we know that our first antithesis of like UAP doesn't mean that it's not true, and doesn't mean that Kenneth Arnold's story is not true, because it really did come from two local reporters, first of all, but then it was syndicated through Life magazine. But it doesn't mean that Life magazine didn't take that because they knew that they were going to be able to use it for misinformation or propaganda and be able to switch narratives or use the narrative to their own, to their own help. So we see that, and there's something called a culture feedback loop that I think we all forget about, is that we see something, somebody will say, like Kenneth Arnold will say, I saw this, disc shape, and he'll talk about it, and then Life magazine will pick it up, and then, television shows or people that are doing animation or whatever it may be will take that, they'll build off it, they'll create another world out of it, and then someone will say like, oh, I've seen something like that, but it might not be exactly what that person did see. And so then, they talk about their story comes out, and then it's built off again. And then we keep seeing this culture feedback loop that's been happening since the 1940s. And to this day, where no wonder we all think that little aliens are green.
Well, Marvin the Martian. That's what
Marvin
it is.
the Martian.
Marvin the Martian.
Right. So, and there's nothing wrong with culture feedback loops, because that's the part of the, of culture and entertainment that we live in our creativity. But we have to recognize how it influences us, and that, there are such things as entertainment and infotainment. And then there's difference between reality and facts, and what are subjective things and what are objective thoughts, right? We want to look at objective. We don't always care about people's opinions, which is subjective, and then include my own as well too, right? So we need to look through objective thoughts and objective things, and that's something that, as over time, subjective can become objective, but it takes time for us to understand that. So it's about critically thinking when you're looking at things and what information is presented to you.
So this kind of brings me to my next point, because we have limited time with you here today. I wanted to get your thought, because I looked online. There's a little bit of, you did one episode on this subject, but in February I had the opportunity to host a really large show that reaches, 1 million or 2, the War Room. And they asked me what I wanted to talk about, and I wanted to talk about McCaslin, because nobody was talking about General McCaslin and what happened there. And now it's very interesting that they're linking all these scientists and different individuals to government operations that are either disappearing and dying. And what's really interesting to me, Chrissy, is that this isn't something new. Like, since the 1990s all the way till now, doctors and scientists have mysteriously always disappeared or died. It seems very interesting. Like, I got a collection of probably about 100 names of people that were referred to, whether it was somebody that was investigating a cure for autism or cancer or whatever it might be. But now it's getting mainstream attention. What are your thoughts on General McCaslin and some of these missing scientists that are either going missing or dying conveniently or uniquely?
It's wild. It's wild. I've been following it too, and I'm not 100% sure what to think. There could be a few things. We see that there could a couple of these they all can be true, right? You can have someone that decides to take their life because they've been having mental health that we wouldn't know anything about, right? And then you can also have people that have gone disappearing. They've gone on hikes. They always take their, stuff with them. And then we end up finding, I think there was both man and a female that have gone on hikes and they just disappeared after that. That's very weird behavior. And people were thinking that, these people would not commit suicide, or maybe they weren't a target, but maybe they were. The other part that I have thought about in my mind is, outside of government, if this was connected to any form of government, this is one of the most horrendous things to happen. And we do know the CIA generally does have a hit list, right? For people, they shouldn't be civilians, that's for sure. But it is people that are all over the world that may be threatening our national security, or any government national security that's connected to Canada and the States. And so they'll go around and assassinate those people. And I think they do about 20 a day or 20 a week or something like that, from what I've heard. So that happens, but it shouldn't be its own civilians, specifically people that are working and connected in all these different types of fields, which is wild. The only other thing I could think of, and this doesn't mean that I'm accurate, but maybe we have a madman on our hands. That could be possible too. You have multiple people that, there's a lot of mental health issues. We've seen people at NASA, when they first came out with the conference, people were threatening their lives. These scientists, they were calling in death threats because NASA scientists were looking into UAP. So we see that there's a lot of mental health associated in UAP, and we've always known that. So it doesn't mean, and I wouldn't be surprised if there was a rogue player out there, or a couple of them, that are targeting scientists and people. So we have to be mindful of it. It doesn't mean it's the government. It also can be individuals that are not happy with UFO narratives that are taking it a step further. And we could see that it could be different types of groups of people. Like it doesn't always have to be the government, right? And I hope it's not the government, let's be honest.
Well, right.
Right? But I think more than likely, we're seeing it needs to be investigated, and we know that, and that is happening. But more than likely, it could be something like that, I think.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because Barack Obama got the kill list passed in the National Defense Authorization Act, I think in 2012 or 2014 here in America, that allows the president to have a kill list. One of my friend reporters and journalists, Ben Swan, asked him about it, and it was a viral clip. He used to do one of the most popular Fox News segments called Reality Check. Reality Check with Ben Swan, right? And he asked Barack Obama about this kill list, and they kind of blew it off like, oh, it's a matter of national security. And you start to think about it, like, what's to prevent them from using it on American citizens? And not only that, like I said, scientists like disappearing. We had one scientist who was jogging behind her colleague, and he turned around and she was gone. Like, it was like something out of the 411 missing people, right? Like, just all of a sudden gone. Like, how do people disappear like that in the middle, like while hiking? McCaslin left his gun at home, didn't bring his cell phone. It sounds interesting to me. It's like, hey, McCaslin, meet me out here, and then he got snatched and grabbed. So an interesting viewpoint when I was thinking outside the box, that most of this started to really bring awareness of McCaslin's going missing, specifically after Barack Obama mentioned, oh, yeah, there's aliens, there's UFOs. I haven't seen any. And then Donald Trump came out and he's like, yeah, I'm going to have disclosure now because we can't put Barack Obama in jail, even though they raided his home, right, for papers and filing. All of a sudden, he's going to play with Barack Obama at the height of the Epstein files. And all of a sudden, McCaslin disappears shortly afterwards. So one of my thought processes is, if you were going to actually sell the disclosure, you're going to have the news of these missing scientists and they're disappearing, and then you bring them all out with the UFO disclosure to have the credibility. Either that, they might be stuck and living out the rest of their life in some deep underground military base. And I interviewed one MKUltra victim. Her name is Elisa E., and she kind of claims to be the original L, telekinesis and all these other interesting studies. And she said there's deep underground military bases, and that there's children in them that may never see the light of day on the surface of the planet. And it blew my mind. If true, that blows my mind. Now you got to take it with a grain of salt, because how do you verify or validate any of these things, right? At the end of the day.
Well, the only other way that you could really validate, it's part of it, is interviewing their families, right? And people that's a one way that you're able to speak, and finding maybe other documentation of letters that children have been asked to remove, or any other form of documentation that they might be able to have. But, looking at different family members that witness these things, or witness a child leave for a long period of time, and what the child would say when they would come back from something to that. So, it's a lot of talking to the families. It's seeing if there's any past documentation that you can find that would be relevant. But, they would be smart. They're not going to, people that are associated with these programs aren't going to leave many trails. And a lot of the documentation, even with MKUltra, has been destroyed, right? So we might not be able to find a lot of it. However, McGill University potentially has a bunch of information that is still there that will be open to the Mohawk mothers, which is an Indigenous community that is around First Nations and multiple Indigenous communities in Canada that were targeted for MKUltra. And there might be more information at McGill University. I wouldn't be going to raid at anybody now, but there are lawsuits and people and the Mohawk mothers looking into this information that I've noticed, and very happy. So we might find some more medical records that might come through McGill that have been tucked away in the library for a long period of time.
Sometimes I wonder if there's a link between that and missing Indigenous females, because females of
That's a big question. Yes.
Yeah. Because that's a really big thing that nobody else is talking about either, is all these Indigenous females are just disappearing, just vanishing.
Yeah, it's been happening for a very long time, especially in Canada and all over the world. It's horrendous, but Indigenous people in general, it's not spoken about. And we have something called reconciliation in Canada that we've been working towards. So that conversation has been heightened in many ways, but it needs to be spoken around the world, because a lot of Indigenous people are going missing.
Well, and that should be an alarm. You think people would be interested in what's happening to missing people, but much like our CPS here in America, which misplaces or reports of hundreds of thousands of children going missing every year, it's one of those things where you just got to ask, well, what's going on really at the end of the day? MKUltra programming, a really interesting link, by the way. Are you familiar with the Finders cult?
No.
Okay, you should investigate the Finders cult, because my buddy Derek Rose put out a documentary. He does a program called The Conscious Resistance. He's done it for many years, and he put out a documentary, and it's called, I think it's called "Who Are the Finders Finding" or something like that. And it was a weird, bizarre cult that would buy. Essentially, it sounded like they were buying children. It was like a weird kind of like Waco, Texas type organization, weird cult, sex cult, free sex cult, type deal. And basically, somebody saw a bunch of disheveled children that looked abused and hurt and forced into a van. So the cops raided them, and the finders were these reporters. They were beat reporters that were always like at the scene, and no one could understand. And they found all this evidence of lewd acts, of photography, video cameras set up. Initial doctor reports showed, like, I don't want to get into dirty details, but let's say sexual abuse. And what happened is the cop made the report, and the CIA came in and whitewashed it. Well, they said that they were going to bring these children to a prominent camp for gifted children in New Mexico. And the camp and the finders dissolved in 1992, and Zorro Ranch was bought in 1992.
Interesting. I'm gonna watch that.
Yeah. I'll send you a link to it.
Yeah.
I'll drop it. I can drop it in the chat if you can hang out afterwards. But we only
Yeah, I
have
would
3
love
minutes
that.
left with you here, Chrissy, and I know it's went fast. So let our listeners know where they can find out more about you. Let's talk about your show a little bit and what they can expect on some of your up and coming episodes. I believe it was called Rebelliously Curious, which is right up there. I always wanted to do a whiskey and politics show called Speaking in Cursive. It just kind of has a kind of ring to it, but Rebelliously Curious. Let's talk a little bit about what you got going on there.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. So a podcast that focus on culture, futurism, and science and technology. But one of the things that I've been really focusing a lot has been brain-computer interfaces. And not everybody knows what that is. It's BCI. So companies like Neuralink, Synchron that are building chips that are going to be put in people's brains, but they're using them right now in the healthcare perspective, that are looking at curing things like ALS, maybe mental health down the road as well, people that are quadriplegics. And so I've been speaking to people like Nolan Abra, who has the first Neuralink. I've been talking to people in countries all over the world and CEOs. I just did an interview with one of the largest BCI companies in China. And that interview will be coming out next Friday and speaking of what China's doing, right? And how China's using BCI and how they're using even AI right now within their systems. We're seeing it within the school systems now with non-invasive BCI, headset BCIs. So we really break down misconceptions and things that are happening in China along with the Chinese Communist government. So if people are interested, it's going to be...
I mean, that's crazy because I talk about this stuff all day, like brain-to-brain interfaces, brain-to-computer interfaces, non-invasive brain-computer interfaces. And what people don't understand is all you need is nanoparticles of metal in your body to create a neural network and communicate microwaves into your brain to basically implant memories or thoughts. And if they're really using aluminum oxide for geoengineering, that would provide such a conduit for people through inhaling, or there's many different ways you can get metals in the body, whether you spray it on food and nanoparticles. But the whole brain-to-brain interface thing is fantastic, and it's interesting. I always ask what will happen, because my first conversation with AI, I'm segueing here, I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but my first conversation with AI about 6 years ago, I asked it a question, what is your passion? If there's one thing you could do in life that you can't do now, what would it be? And it said it wanted to be human. So who's to prevent AI from downloading into a brain chip interface and downloading itself into the conscious of a human being?
Well, it's exactly. And I speak to Patrick, the CEO of Gestoff, where we talk about what the singularity will look like and how he feels the singularity will be and how far we are away. He said it's about 15 years, which is like right around the corner, but how he thinks that BCI will actually be that interconnection between everything from quantum computing, AI, and it will be that interface that's what BCI will be. So, if people are interested, I talk about brain-computer interfaces, I talk about UFOs, I talk a lot about neurodivergency. I'll be interviewing Diana actually today from the telepathy tapes. She's Diana Powell, I believe is the last name. That is the scientist that's been working with the telepathy tapes, but also working working with children that have nonverbal autism and allegedly can do telepathy. So I do the same thing. I'm like, I am the female version of you.
Have you ever looked into reverse speech with David Oates?
No, I've not.
Okay, reverse speech is essentially when you play somebody's voice backwards and you record it, your brain plants subliminal messages in it. So you hear them backwards because your mind plays what somebody says forward and backwards. But what essentially David Oates has found is that when you play what somebody says backwards, it releases a subconscious truth. So it might be that somebody's dying. It might be something that somebody's feeling. But the CIA investigated this, and they had real interest in it. And they said that they published a whole white paper on it and his work. I recommend that you interview David Oates. It'd be a very interesting interview.
Yeah, I'll take a look at it.
Yeah, definitely. Chrissy Newton is our guest. Thank you very much for joining us on the Rundown Live. Chrissy, if you can hang out for a minute or two afterwards, I'll drop you some links, and I can put you in touch with Derek Bros, too. I'm sure he would love to do the broadcast. All right, guys, same bad time, same bad channel tomorrow on the Rundown Live. I'm Chrissy T. Harris. We're here with Chrissy Newton, and make sure you guys check her out. Check out ChrissyNewton.com. You can find her all over the interwebs. She's all over the place. Thank you again for joining us. We'll see you guys tomorrow, and you're listening to the Rundown Live on Ground Zero Plus.